All right. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Comprehensivist Wednesday, where we study transdisciplinary connections between fields, polymathy, comprehensivism. And I'm delighted to have, as always, Sanjay here um, talking about neuroscience. We are doing a series on neuroscience. We're going to be doing one meetup a month this year, all this year. So really looking forward to it. So Sanjay, what are we doing today?
Okay, so today we're going to talk about the child mind, so minds of non-adults. And the purpose for this, I mean, I put a little bit of description on the meetup page, but we've been mostly focused on, we've been mostly interested in the adult brain because that's the more interesting area, that's the more complex area. But I think that it will help, it definitely will help us to understand ourselves, our adult brains, if we start first with the child brain and look at that, because it is a simpler form of the brain. It's something that the child brain is not as complex because it hasn't done all of the years of learning that we've gone through, and not just learning, formal learning, but even learning through the world. There's a lot of knowledge and encoding that our brain has by the time it becomes an adult. So I think starting with the child's brain is a good way to explore.
No, I agree. I think, when you proposed a bunch of topics, I strongly recommended starting with the child's brain, because I found that when you're trying to study anything in evolution, if you get the earlier form, it helps you to understand the later form because you can see what it was and from which it is going to grow. So I think this is a perfect place to start.
So let me get my screen sharing. Okay, is it visible? It should be visible now.
Yes, it is.
Okay, all right. So we'll move on to. So what I wanted to do first, I wanted to start with an overview of the different phases that our brain goes through, I mean, as we go into this, we'll see a lot of parallels. Well, also, what I want to do today, I want to use some techniques that are comprehensivist in the sense that we want to use knowledge from many different areas and many different ways of looking at something, ways of looking at the brain in this case, and how it develops and how it changes over time. So I think that's an important element that will help us to understand, because one of the challenges in the neurosciences is that there is so much information, and combining the information, integrating the information into a cohesive picture becomes very difficult oftentimes, because each piece of information is very difficult to interpret on its own. So when you combine various areas of knowledge, various information that we learn through studies, it gives us additional insight. So one of the things we want to do is we want to look at the developing brain. And so, and there's no right or wrong way to do this, but what I've done is I've divided a typical lifespan, a typical life of a person into 5 stages, right? And they can be done in fewer or more stages, but there's no right or wrong here. But this, I put 5 stages because this will help us. There's significant phases that we go through that are important to understand. So the first is in utero, which is pre-birth in the gestational period. The next is infancy, and more specifically, it's from the time of birth up to the time when we start to acquire language, which is usually around 3 or 4 years old, 2 to 4 years old, depending on the child. Then another phase is the child/teen years, and then we have adult life, which spans several decades, and then old age, which is also several decades. And this will help us to understand, because there are distinct, not only behavioral characteristics in us in each of these phases, but also our brain is in very, very different stages. The rates of growth of various areas are different. There are many, many distinct and unique characteristics of the brain, physically and functionally in these stages. So for me, these 5 stages are the best way to explain it, but this can be done in 4 stages and 3 stages, probably in more stages, but I think 5 is a good number. Also, what I wanted to do is I wanted to cover, and Shrikant, when you described this, you hit on a very key word. You mentioned evolutionary, and evolution is very important in biology. That's definite. But it's also very important in brain function. And one of the things I want to go into today is how evolution not only has shaped our brain, but it continues to shape how our brain develops over time. So even after we start to be, after we even before birth, while we're gestating in our mother's womb, evolution is driving everything about our brain. And even after our brain, after we're born. So for example, initially, in utero, the structure, the shape of our brain, the structures of different regions of our brain, these things are controlled by evolution. And how and when they differentiate into the various regions of our brain, these are also controlled by evolution. And also the core functions are controlled by evolution. Now, specifically with our brain, because evolution is something that happens on such a large time scale. But what I'm saying here is, when I talk about evolutions, I'm talking about DNA, because DNA is a result of our evolution. It is the encoded form. It is basically a program. It's a very sophisticated program that encodes a lot of instructions on how to grow a human being or any organism. In this case, we're talking about a human being, more specifically, a human being's brain. So our DNA encodes within it not just what the final brain needs to be, but it also encodes the order in which different parts of the brain first develop and they mature, and then other parts of the brain develop and attach and et cetera. So this is an important aspect that evolution and our DNA drives in how our brain grows and develops. So growth mimics evolution during gestation. That's a simple way of explaining this. Growth also, after birth, we continue, our brain continues to grow, develop, and mature even after birth. So the second bullet is really before birth, during gestation. The third bullet is after birth, it continues, and I'm going to go into it a little bit. And then well after birth, it continues. But after that, there are many other forces, especially our societal forces, our environment, the family unit, the schooling system, the social environment that we're in, and our peers. All of these affect how our brain grows and develops subsequently. So it's after a certain age, it's no longer, or predominantly, it's no longer a DNA. So this is a simple graph. Now this graph is very rough, and I don't want people to look at the actual area. Basically, what's important here is the rough shape of the graph. What I've done here is I have 4 different aspects of brain growth that I'm describing here. And
Sanjay, let me ask one question about the previous slide. When I went through Jacob Branowski's Ascent of Man, he had a really profound observation. He called it the long childhood. The human beings are characterized by long childhood. So if you take something like a snake, whenever it is born, its brain of a little snake is pretty much, they are able to do pretty much anything a big snake can do, only on a smaller scale. Whereas when we are born, our brain is half the size, it's half formed. So what is the significance of that?
So, I mean, there's so many aspects that when I'm going into these things, I'm leaving out so many because it's difficult to go into all of it, but this is the next one area that you brought up. So yes, I mean, what's unique about human beings and most animals, especially most mammals, other than primates, and even many primates, when they're born, they are nearly fully functioning, and almost everything that they need to survive on their own, it already exists in their brain. Some primates are social animals, like some of the higher primates, orangutans and chimpanzees especially. But even the lower form primates, bonobos and others, and all mammals, all other types of animals, once they're born, their brain doesn't need to physically mature, and their brain has basically matured to the level that it needs to for them to function and survive throughout their lives. However, for humans, it's very different, and this is something that shaped us through evolution, and it shaped our brain and the female body also, because one of the characteristics of humans is that our brain size is fairly large relative to our body size. And there's many theories around that. I won't go into that area, but what that means is that for us to become more complicated and more able, more capable, our physical brain will have to grow in utero, okay? And that causes a lot of difficulty because the way the birth canal is, the difficulty on the pregnant woman, the risk to her, because this is why human births are much more risky than most other animal births, and it takes so much longer because our head size, our cranial size is so much larger relative to the birth canal. And also through evolution, this is one of the reasons why our skulls are not solid at the time of birth. Our skull actually consists of, I believe it's 10 different segments of bone that have soft tissue in between. And so our cranium basically deforms as it passes through the birth canal to allow us. And it's an adaptation that helps us to be born, but also it helps our mother to remain alive. Because one of the important aspects for us is that after we're born, we need an adult to help us to grow and nurture. We cannot survive on our own when we're an infant. So there are many aspects of our biology and our DNA that have been shaped by this, because our brain, at the time of birth, our brain is not fully functional. We cannot feed ourselves, we can't move. We're basically dependent on our mother and if we have parents, then our parents, or a smaller group of caretakers. And this is very important because what that means is in our infancy, we are dependent on these adults, and we're very vulnerable. And so that also shaped a lot of what happens in our brain. Because of that, this is one of the reasons why we have oxytocin and other neurotransmitters at a higher level than other animals, because the maternal fetal bond, the maternal infant bond, the father's infant bond, these bonds, our brain engenders these bonds through multiple neurotransmitters. It artificially creates them, whereas in other animals, it doesn't happen that way. So in humans, when we're born, our parents start loving us automatically because of their brain chemistry. And similar to us, the infant also has similar things happening in its brain that helps it to adapt to the early parents or the early caregivers that it sees. So this is very important that we are totally dependent at the time of birth. And so that affects how our brain develops, and what are the initial things that we learn is very different from other animals and other primates.
Thank you.
So hopefully that answer. I mean, I suspect that was
excellent.
Time, but I think that was good enough for our purposes now. So what I do want to do is I do want to go into some aspects of brain growth, and this graph. And for those of you who don't like graphs and things, I'll try to explain it. So the y-axis is basically percentage of growth, okay? And the x-axis is around time, and I started with the left side is in utero, then we have birth, and this is not linear time. So, the time difference between in utero and birth is 9 months, but the rightmost side is old age, which is, in the 70s, 80s, 90s for most people now, most adults now. So this is not a linear scale on the x-axis. Please understand that. And that's the reason why this graph is not necessarily accurate. It's very difficult to come up with graphs like this that would be representative across all people, because this actually changes based on, there's several things that changes. For example, one, whether it's a male or female, it will affect this, but also various other things also. So in general, what this graph is showing is on the left vertical column is percentage of growth. So the bottommost, I don't know if is my mouse visible on the screen when I move it? I'm not sure if it is. If it isn't,
Yeah, it is. It is.
Okay, so I'm talking about the bottom left corner here. So this is at the time, this is the time of conception. And basically the brain is size 0 in all respects at the time of conception at the bottom left. And then it's, around this time is when birth happens. I don't know if it's going to be, my mouse was probably moving faster on my screen than it is on your screen, but this is around the time of birth. So at the time of birth, our brain really has not fully developed to the level that it needs to be functional. It's around 80%, 60 to 80% developed, depending on which part of the brain is there, which part of the brain we're looking at. And there are four colored lines on this chart that I have. The red line represents the total, actually, let me start with the blue line. The blue line is the middle in here. It's harder to see, but it's the middle line. And that is the total average mass of the brain. Total average, you can say the size of the brain, the total size of the brain. Okay. Next is the red line, and that along with the green line, which is the lowest. So the red is the topmost and the green is the bottommost line. These two represent what are known as gray matter and white matter. And these are very important areas of the brain when we're looking at brain. And gray matter and white matter grow at different rates. And again, this is a biological reason why, because for humans, we don't need white matter as much early in life. And another thing that we have to remember, and this is something that I've said many times through many of these talks, is that biology, and especially neurobiology, is very much dependent on energy. Our body and our brain is always managing energy, not only the amount of energy that we have, but the amount of energy that our brain needs, and also the amount of energy that our body uses to create brain cells, to create neurons, and to allow our brain to work. So one of the reasons why this green line is low in the beginning is because technically our body does not really need, this again is white matter. And I'll explain the difference in white matter and gray matter in a few minutes, but bear with me that one area of our brain called white matter is not necessary in the beginning. And so our brain does not use the energy and the molecules, the food that we eat, the infant is having to eat lots of food in the beginning to grow itself, to grow its body and its brain. So our DNA doesn't put that energy into growing white cells, white matter, which are basically the myelination around cells, around axons. It does put a lot of that energy into growing the gray matter. Okay? And then the fourth line is the purple line, which is kind of in the middle here, just above this blue. And this is the number of neurons. And these are four different ways, and there are many other ways of looking at brain size, but these are four very simple ways of looking at brain size, which helps us to understand what, why, and again, I have these vertical lines here are the 5 regions that I talked about, the 5 phases of life that I split this into. The leftmost phase of life is in utero, prior to birth. The first line is at the time of birth. And then the second line is around the middle of childhood. The third line is a little bit after adulthood. So age 18 is here in the bottom, and a little bit, so in your probably mid to late 20s is where this third line is. And then the fourth line, which separates adulthood from old age, is here toward the right side. And I also have this other line, which is this dashed dotted line, which says 95% developed. And this is important because this is the time, this explains the time around which, and again, these are rough times, this is not exact, but it's around the time when about 95% of a typical human brain has fully developed in all senses, except white matter. White matter develops much, much later, and I'll explain that later.
About what age is that, 95%?
So this is around between age 6 to 8.
Okay.
And it varies depending on, so one of the challenges with the brain development is it's not just our DNA, because after birth, the DNA, as we age from birth onward, so from birth, so you can think of, there's another way to look at this number, this graph, is that prior to this birth line, okay, to the left of this birth line, DNA is primarily responsible for our growth of our brain, okay? From this birth line, this first leftmost line, up to around the 95% line, DNA is mostly responsible, but also certain aspects of our environment is responsible. For example, the feeding that we do, the nourishment that we get, that's responsible. That's a very, very important aspect of this until we get to about 95%, because nourishment and not just the volume of nourishment, not just amount of milk, but the types of nutrition that we get, how nutritious the food is. So this is one of the reasons why when I say this is a typical, if a child is undernourished or they grow in an environment where they don't have adequate food, this 95% will probably be delayed further to the right. This is for an average healthy adult, healthy child who's being raised in a proper environment. And this is the reason why these graphs are so difficult to generalize, because there's so many different ways that a child can be raised, environments that they grow up in. So anyway, so around 95% of the brain is developed, physically developed, and functioning by around age 7. And this white matter continues till around, this is around, most of it grows around age 12 to 13. And it, sorry about that, my voice is starting to crack a little bit. And white matter is starts to complete after we reach age 18, after adulthood, usually in the mid to late 20s. And this is why I have it saturating and reaching around 100% after this, when we're into the adulthood period. And that's something that we'll talk about a little bit. And all of the topics that we talk about today affect not only the child's brain, they affect the adult brain also. But we're going to focus on the differentiation between child brain, the infant brain, the teen brain, these three areas, and compare it with the adult brain. So so I don't know if there are any questions at this point.
The only thing I would say is that the most stunning part of this graph is the disparity between all the other lines and the green line, that white matter. So I'm all ears whenever you're going to disclose what it is and what is its function and why is it delayed as compared to other things. Go ahead.
Thanks. So let's start with the infant brain. So this is the brain after it's born. Actually, no, we're going to start with the infant brain from conception up to the birth. So one of the things that we understand is that this time period, these 9 months, are a time of extremely rapid growth. Okay, more than half of the brain, more than half of the volume of the brain, more than half of the neurons, close to 60% of neurons have grown in 9 months. Okay, so we start first with a few cells, with one cell, basically the zygote, or actually the zygote, I believe, starts at 8 cells, and it quickly, rapidly grows into many, many cells. And then around a few weeks, actually, let me move on my screen. I have something blocking part of it. There it is. So after around 3 weeks, there's something in our brain called the neural tube, which starts to form. And around this time also, what happens is that, and this is all about the human brain. This is specific to us. And by that time, our cells have actually formed into a C shape. So basically, and this is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to also talk about evolution. And I'm going to, so let me jump a little bit here. I'm just going to jump. So this is a picture of a very, very simple animal. It probably may be a worm. It may be an insect. But basically, this is a bilateral animal, which means an animal which has the left half of its body and the right half of its body. It has bilateral symmetry. Okay, and this describes most animals that we're familiar with. Okay, there are animals that don't have bilateral symmetry. They're much more simpler. For example, the hydra or certain, the octopi, octopus, for example. But most animals that we're familiar with have bilateral symmetry, which means it's the left half of its body and the right half of its body are mirror images of each other. Okay? And this is a side profile. So let's say that we're looking at this. This may be a worm, or it may be an insect. It may be a dragonfly. Many animals have this shape. And what this is showing is that as the animal develops, and this may be a fully formed animal, but this is actually how we as a fetus begin to grow. We actually resemble this form very early, around 2 weeks of time. we resemble something very much like this. And so in evolutionary terms, when a worm has grown into its fully formed body, it's grown in, I don't know exactly.
Okay, looks like Sanjay, there is a problem. We can't hear you. Give me just a second. Folks, Sanjay should be back in a second. Let me go ahead and text him. All right, give me just a second. Okay, I'm going to unmute everybody. Let me go ahead. He will recover and join shortly. Let me just text him, let him know. All right. Give me a second. Okay, looks like his computer crashed. Okay, so let me continue. Let me just add something to what he's saying. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit more about this concept of the long childhood. Sanjay talked about the cost of the long childhood, that somebody has to take care, that you're helpless, somebody has to take care. It's an enormous investment, okay? And evolution does not put in investment like that without payoffs, okay? So the question is, what is the payoff? What is the payoff of being born with your brain half formed and remaining helpless for a significant part of your lifespan? What is the advantage of long childhood? The primary advantage is that the brain develops in interaction with the world and with other people. What that does is that it allows for a flexibility of behavior, a learning at a level which is completely, like orders of magnitude, different from a being whose brain is fully formed at birth. If the brain is fully formed, it may think, like when you say it's fully formed, so it's good. No, because fully formed means at that point their ability to learn is less, because we are born with our brain half formed. We are able to learn. We are able to learn from others. We are able to learn from interaction with each other. We are able to absorb culture, and that goes on while the brain is developing. So these two are not two separate processes. So you are taking in the information, and there is a physical change in the brain and learning happening at the same time. So that's what the power of long childhood is. The second point I want to make was the theme that Sanjay started talking about, and that is he was pointing to the worm. There is a concept called evo-devo, which is a very deep concept in biology. What it means is that, hi Sanjay, are you back? Okay, Sanjay just joined.
Yes, sorry, I'm not sure what happened.
All right, but you are back though. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. I don't know.
Don't worry. I kept the conversation going. I kept it going. So no problem. Go ahead. You can bring up the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
So the concept of evo-devo is a huge concept, and that's what Sanjay is talking about. Go ahead, Sanjay.
Right. So hopefully it's visible again.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So what I wanted to convey is the idea that in utero, when we develop from a fetus into a full baby, our growth in utero actually follows a very similar, and this is something that this is not understood very well, but it seems to, this is a very general principle. So what I'm trying to explain here is that this is not accepted or even understood that well by scientists, but this seems to be the case. there are many, many strong parallels. So I don't want to say that this is exactly what happens, that our growth in utero follows exactly the evolutionary path, but it mimics it to such remarkable levels that it's surprising. So that's what I'm trying to show here, is that when a simple organism like a worm or an insect, like a dragonfly, let's say, this is the thorax, the main body of the dragonfly, let's say. So when it's developing, the way it develops is very similar to how we develop in the initial first few weeks. And then after that, we start to develop into what, as evolution progressed and we went from dragonfly type of organisms into more complex organisms, then we went into, for example, maybe an amphibian or maybe a reptile, and then we bifurcated into mammals. So that aspect of evolution, where our biology changed from being of this shape, a linear shape, very simple organism, into an organism which has typically 4 limbs. Also, we're bilateral, bilateral symmetry, but we're more complex inside. Our organs are more complex, our brain is more complex. So this is basically what happens, very similar to what happens in us. So this is the starting point. This is what I wanted to show, is that this is the starting point, of our development in utero. So we start is something like this, okay? Except we actually start in the shape of a C. So if you think of this hurled up into a shape of a C, that's actually how the very early form of a human fetus is. Except some of these elements are not as pronounced. They're much simpler. Here, the brain is very large and the nerve cord is quite large, but it's not necessarily, it's a rough analogy. And so this black line, which is called the nerve cord in the brain, is called the neural cord. And that's the first layer in our development. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into, let me try to go into, I have a slide here that helps to explain how this develops. And it's pretty fascinating. I won't go too much into this. This is not essential for you to understand, but this is important because it helps to understand the differentiation. Again, this is our DNA driving all of this. So our DNA causes, when we're a simple tube, our DNA causes a tube inside of a tube to grow, and then another tube inside, 2 other tubes inside that tube to grow. So our body resembles the form of a long tube, and then our gastrointestinal tract, which is from our mouth to our anus, that's a tube inside, and then our neural tube is another tube inside. So these 2 tubes form within our body cavity, which is itself a tube, and it's very fascinating. So this is just a simple example. So think of this as we're looking at this as this area is the head, and this area is the tail, and so this is the left side of the body, and this is the right side of the body. Okay? And this surface is on the top of, let's say that the whole body is a round tube. Okay, so this is describing the outermost surface of a body, which has already formed a tube. And so the outermost surface of the body at the upper layer starts to form a crease down its entire length. So if you go back to the previous slide, all along this topmost layer, okay, all along this topmost layer, a crease will form. Okay? And this crease will be this type of indentation. And this indentation will get more and more pronounced. And over time, this layer, hopefully everybody can see that it will fold into this type of layer. So these green areas are the 2 green areas here. The large purple has folded into this U shape, and the blue remain the blue on the side. So the blue you can think of is the outermost skin on this worm or on this human fetus. Okay, so the blue is the outermost skin layer. This green are some of the initial neural tubes that they are part of what will be part of the central nervous system. And the purple is also what will be part of the central nervous system. And this continues folding until it reaches this rightmost part where it completely folds in, and this blue area then becomes the outermost skin, which is the epidermis. Okay? And the inner part, this purple part inside, is what's known as the neural tube. And it's a long tube that runs for most of the length of the body, okay? From the part of the body where we would have a tail. Now remember that because we evolved from animals that had tails, when we're a fetus, we actually have a tail inside our body. And so this neural tube runs from that tail area up to our brain. And this green part is actually what becomes our spinal cord. And these floating dots, these floating green dots on both sides, become our peripheral nervous system. They grow into the various nerves throughout our body. So this is the inception of our central nervous system. I wanted to show that because it's fascinating once you understand. So this entire black area has that happening. So if you think of this, here you'll have that same neural formation. Here, all along it, you'll have the same neural formation. And each of these points, you'll have branches of those green cells. They'll extend into the further areas of the body, and they'll start to grow into the different organs, and those nerves will enmesh and grow into the organs. So for example, when our heart beats because there are nerves going from our brain to our heart that causes the heart muscles to contract in a timed rhythmic fashion. Those nerves are vital for our heart function. And so that happens simultaneous to, so our heart, while our brain, our central nervous system is growing, other organs are also growing simultaneously, although they grow at different rates. But the integration between them happens simultaneously. So as our various organs grow, the brain integrates with them simultaneously as they grow together. So let me jump back to this slide because we were just talking about the second bullet here, the she-shaped formation. So that worm or the dragonfly shape that we looked at on the slide actually has a C shape inside the human body, inside the womb. And this is the neural tube that I talked about, the formation of the neural tube, and then the CNS, the central nervous system. So all of this starts to develop around 3 weeks of gestation. And the woman probably doesn't even know that she's pregnant at that time, but it starts to form. And then around 5 weeks later, and this can vary slightly, but what happens is the neural tube starts to, so this third bullet is talking about the brain region. Okay? So, in this slide, we have the entire neural tube. Now we're going to start focusing only on the brain because the brain is the most important part. Now the rest of it will start to continue its development. It'll continue to grow into our full central nervous system in a very sophisticated manner. But today we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk only about the brain and how it develops. Okay, so the brain develops into 3 brain regions, and they're called vesicles. Okay? And over time, they develop, and the development of these 3 brain regions also mimic the development in the various animals through many different species. So the lower form of species basically have 2 types of regions in their brain. So actually, when I say 3 here, it actually starts with 2, and one of those splits, giving us 3. So I've taken a shortcut here. So very much like in evolution, the development of the primordial brain grew in 2 parts, and then it grew into 3 parts. And then those 3 parts, each of those vesicles subdivided into further regions. So going from very simple organisms to, let's say, a frog or a lizard, and then going into a more complex animal, such as a bird, which is another more complex form of a lizard, because a bird evolved from dinosaurs, which evolved from lizards. And then there was a split from the time of lizards into the mammalian tree. And so because we follow that tree, our DNA actually follows that tree, no longer the lizard tree. So then our brain starts to develop into these 3 brain regions, and these 3 distinct regions subdivide further. Each of these vesicles subdivides further into specialized regions. And DNA drives this growth, the structure of these regions, the types of cells in them, the very different types of cells in them. It drives everything. The DNA drives everything about the specific formation of our brain. Okay? So now I have a slide that's going to try to help us to look at exactly what happens in the human brain. Okay? So these again, so I have 5 different segments of time. So this first segment is around 30 days, so about a month into gestation. And this yellow, red, orange, blue section is the neural tube that we talked about. And again, remember, this is a C shape. I talked about the C shape formation. So this is how a real human fetus begins, in a C-shaped formation. And this neural tube is on the outermost, on the back. So this is the head, right? This is the stomach area, right? These are the initial, you can say, the forearms, okay? And the neural tube and the spinal cord runs all along this. So the yellow part is mostly the spinal cord. The red part is the brain stem. It's the most primordial region. This is what, and I'm going to use terms that are more layperson. The official terms are much more complicated, and it's harder to remember. And I also don't remember all of them. This is not something that I work with all the time. So the diencephalon, the periencephalon. Basically, the encephalon refers to these regions of the brain, of the human brain. And there are three main regions. And then this next region here is, I believe this is at 50 days of gestation. No, this is at 40 days. I think I've done this for 10 apart. So this is 40 days of gestation. And what we notice is that this neural tube in the beginning remained in a long, continuous tubal fashion, right? But at this point, it's still in a tubal fashion, but what happens is it starts to fold upon itself. Okay? This section, now internally, if you look in detail in this, and this picture doesn't show it, but internally, this remains in a very continuous fashion so that if let's say electricity or at this point, there are no blood vessels here, but if there were blood vessels flowing and there was blood flowing in this, it would be able to continuously flow from the tip to the tail continuously, because showing that this is still a continuous tube. And even to the end, you'll see that there still remains a continuous tube even to the end. But what happens later after this, something else happens and it becomes much more complicated after that, again, because of our DNA. But what happens post is that this middle section, which used to be the midbrain, splits into two different regions. And this frontmost section, which is the forebrain, which develops into our cortex, into the cortical region, actually splits into two parts, which you can kind of see a green area and an aqua area. And it's more pronounced here in the later sections. These divisions continue further. Okay, this is just a 1 point. So I've shown this up to 60 days of gestation, up to the beginning of the second trimester. Okay, and then it continues further, and into the third trimester is when this really it becomes very, very rapid. The development of the brain really gets supercharged, and it's much more complicated. It's not so easy to talk about here, and there are not too many, for ethical reasons, there are not too many accurate anatomical records that we have, but we do have, because if a fetus dies, we are able to do an autopsy and study it. Physicians and scientists can do that, but it's more difficult to do that. So what I want everyone to understand is that the neural tube basically stays for most of the developmental period during gestation. But one of the important things to understand is that this neural tube, especially in the brain region, inside the skull, it starts to fold upon itself. Right? And this area, the purple area, and this yellow area actually falls, relative size also is something that changes. So the relative size of this green and blue area has grown much more than the other areas have grown. And what that happens is that this blue and green area grows so large that they actually envelop, they encircle, and they completely cover the other areas. And that's what happens in the human brain when the baby's born. And I'll have a slide later that shows that, although it won't go into the inside because it's very difficult to show that on a single slide. Let me see if so this is a picture of the fully formed brain and this is roughly what it is at the time of birth. And so this topmost area, which is the green, purple, orange, and red, is the cortex. And this is the cortex is the part analogous to this image. It's this blue and green area. The blue and green area is comparable to this large area, which we consider most of our brain. And this is predominantly the thinking part of our brain. Okay? Then we have this part down here, which is the cerebellum. Okay? The cerebellum is also important, and the cerebellum is basically this yellow part of the brain. Okay, and then what's not visible in this picture is inside is what's known as the midbrain. Okay, for example, the limbic system, the thalamus, the hypothalamus. These regions are all inside the center of the brain. They're literally inside the center of the brain, because when the cortex grows, it grows all around everything else. It envelops everything else. It's like a blanket that covers everything. And so the cortex on most pictures looks this way, but inside is where the earlier parts of the brain exist. Now, also another part that's important to understand is that when our brain has developed and when it's become, this is the infant brain, when it's become the infant brain, it's functionally, it still has many of the aspects that primitive animals have. So for example, the cerebellum still does what it did in primitive animals. The brainstem, which is at the core all the way inside. In this picture, it might be a little bit easier. It's this vertical, angular region. It's also in us. And I'll go into a little bit of this. And then the midbrain is all the way hidden inside, and that's also there. And each of these brain regions are there for a reason. So let me step back a little bit, and we'll go back and finish off this slide that I just wanted to go into. So we covered the first 4 bullets. This 5th bullet is differentiation into major structures of the brain. Okay, and this starts to happen around 12 weeks, but it continues into into full gestation period until the baby's born. Now, what's important here, and the reason why I came back to this is because this differentiation, the reason why it's important is because the various regions of the brain that develop, they become active while it's developing. So as the fetus is growing, these parts of the brain regions actually start to work. They actually start to do work. Okay? This is the reason why in a very young fetus, in a very early fetus around, I think, I don't remember exactly how long, but I think it's around the 6th or 7th week, the heartbeat develops. The reason why the heartbeat can develop in a fetus that young is because the brain region that's responsible for regulating the heartbeat has already developed. So that part of the brain has already developed in a fetus that young. And that part of the brain is fully taking over the role of keeping the heart functioning. Okay? And as the fetus grows further and further, various parts of the brain develop further. And so as the body's functional needs materialize, meaning as various parts of the organ systems materialize in the fetus, that part of the brain has already developed at that time. And so our DNA, what it's doing is it's synchronizing. Our DNA, again, remember, it's a program. That program has built within it the synchronizing behavior that this organ will develop at this time period, and the brain will develop in parallel around that same time period, so that they're developing together, and the brain can then help that organ if it needs it, and vice versa. Okay? So our circulatory system also starts to develop at a certain point, and our brain needs the circulatory system after a certain point. So it's not just a one-sided, it's not just that the brain helps the other organs. Other organs also help our brain further develop itself and become more sophisticated. Because one of the things that you have to understand is that the brain uses, and in one of our earlier talks, I talked about the brain using close to 25% of the energy that a person consumes in a typical time. Okay? And what that means is that all of that energy that's consuming also requires it to the normal processes of respiration, it creates, as all of the cells inside the brain go through the normal metabolic processes. The brain has to get oxygen, it has to give off carbon dioxide, it has to have waste products, it has to get nourishment, it has to cool itself, because all of these metabolic activity generates heat. So the brain becomes very, very hot. Literally, it's a hot organ. It's functioning very, very hot. So the circulatory system has to develop simultaneously to help cool the brain, to help nourish the brain, bring food to it, to bring oxygen to it, remove carbon dioxide. So all these things are happening in parallel. So what I'm talking about here is differentiation into major structures of the brain. And that happens as the body functionally needs it. This is very, very critical to understand, because as the brain develops, different parts of that brain is becoming active, and it's starting to keep the baby alive, and it's starting to do what it's supposed to do. Right? This continues until the time of birth. The baby gets born, and then past the time of birth, this continues for around a year, maybe possibly longer. We're not sure how long, but probably for a few early years. The physical development and the physiological development continues of the brain, but also integration of the control of the body. Okay? So for example, regulating our temperature, the ability to move our muscles, balance control, the many physiological aspects that our brain initially does. So when we talked about earlier that when we are born, many parts of our brain have not fully developed as they do in other mammals, in other primates. But in our brain, they actually continue developing after birth, because now we're outside of our mother's body. So our brain can physically continue growing, and this is why the baby continues growing physically, and their head continues growing, because the brain still needs to develop many, many functions to help us stay alive and to help us become self-sufficient. So some of the things here that happen are that our brain and our body form very strong bonds, very strong interconnections and regulatory pathways that where our brain still is able to control many aspects of our body, and vice versa. Our body helps to our brain function in many ways. So I'm going to skip through these because we discussed these already. So
can you pause briefly on this slide? I would just want to make one comment.
Sure. I think the next one, I think we have questions answered. I don't remember exactly, but yeah, we have questions answered after this. So we can pause at this point if you want.
Okay. So just want to make one observation here. And this is going to be the theme of the interview on Saturday. This is the work of Jack Panksepp, who's one of the pioneers in studying the mammalian brains, from the more primitive mammals all the way to human beings. And his concept, he calls it the archaeology of the mind. So you can look at this brain, right now, Sanjay described the evolutionary process of how these pieces get together and get kind of folded on each other, and the later folds kind of envelope the previous folds. You can also look at it, a fully formed brain, like a Grand Canyon. There are things at the top, and as you go further and further down, those parts are older and older. So you can think of it as doing archaeology of the brain to see various parts of the brain and their different evolutionary functions and how they developed. And so that's what we're going to be talking about with the author Lucy Bevan, especially focusing on the nature of emotions. So they've identified these 7 emotions, and we're going to be talking about how these emotions work in the brain at kind of the neuroanatomical level, neurochemical level, at the behavioral level, and at the affect level. So don't miss that. That's going to be incredible. But it kind of builds on the same idea that Sanjay is talking about. Go ahead, Sanjay.
Yeah, that's excellent point. I mean, that's actually something that I want to go into a little bit. I in the beginning of the talk, when I talked about comprehensivism, this is an aspect of comprehensivism and many other areas, but I may not be able to as we go because I'm trying to cover a lot of things in the time we have. So I may not, elaborate on the comprehensivist aspect of how this knowledge has been arrived and how it integrates together. But in my mind, the archaeology of the brain is exactly how I see it also. But I didn't raise it because it's difficult for me to explain to other people who might not see this. But the archaeology is a study of prehistoric time, but we're talking about not just prehistoric time, we're talking about hundreds of millions of years of prehistory. Okay, that's the level of archaeology far beyond human archaeology. Okay, but it's exactly encoded in this. The brain and our DNA encodes all of that exactly. And once we start to go into this, we start to see that, and it helps us to understand. So that's very important. That's an excellent point that I want to.
How about taking, shall we take a couple of questions and then to continue?
I just want to mention just very quickly. So overall, so this is at the time of birth, just very quickly. So the infant brain at the time of birth, the cerebral cortex has roughly 19 billion neurons in it. And the cerebellum, which is actually, people may not realize this, cerebellum, the name cerebellum is Latin for little brain. It's a tiny brain. And because in primitive animals, the cortex was tiny or even non-existent. Their brain mainly consisted of the cerebellum. That was the main brain that they had. But in humans, the cerebellum is much smaller, and the cortex has taken over because for us, we're much more, this is the reason why we're much more sophisticated, because this gives us much more advanced abilities. But here's something that's surprising. The cortex only has 19 billion neurons compared to the cerebellum having 82 billion. Okay? That's a 4 times difference. Okay? So what this tells us is the number of neurons are not important for intelligence or sophisticated behavior. It's not the number of neurons that are important. This is the point I want to say. Also, another aspect of this is that when the human brain, when the child is born, the child's brain has roughly 100 billion neurons. Okay? The adult brain pares that down, okay, to around 86 billion neurons. Okay? So again, The number of neurons is not important for intelligence because an adult is typically more intelligent than a human, or sorry, than an infant, even though they have fewer neurons. So this is important to understand. The number of neurons are not important. We'll get into what is, or possibly, but we don't know for sure. This is the problem with research because it's very difficult to know. But let's stop here and we'll do some Q&A.
Okay, Sanjay, I want to get some sense of the length of the presentation. This is approximately what percentage presentation so far, you think?
This is probably about half or
Half
maybe
of
little, yeah, I mean, we
Okay.
can
Perfect. All right, folks. So it's going to be Claudio followed by Vanessa. Just keep your questions very brief. Okay. I want to go to questions and then we want to continue. We'll take about 3 or 4 questions. Claudio, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. What happens to the brain structurally pertaining to the gray matter, white matter, neurons, lobes, neurons, etc. if a child is neglected? What happens to its brain, either short-term, mid-term, or long-term? Thank you. Structurally. Yeah.
So I'm not a developmental biologist, but so one of the things that I mentioned was that after birth, the environment that the baby is in, especially the nurture, the amount of nurture, both physical nurture in terms of nourishment and also emotional nurture, these are very, very important. Your question has to do with, I'm going to assume your question has to do with both aspects of these, physical and emotion and social nurturing. So the physical nurturing is extremely, extremely important in infancy. If an infant, and physical nurturing has to do not just with food, it has to do with the environment. So if the baby is born, is kept in a very cold environment, the house is not heated, or the domicile is not heated, or and for example, this is one of the things that we suspect when in our prehistory, and again going back to archaeology, when we were nomads and we lived in caves or we lived outside and we didn't have housing structures, our neurodevelopment would have been thwarted, it would have been slower. And this is again speculation, we don't know, but we suspect, given all what we understand, this is a reasonable assumption to make, is that the environment would have been less conducive to a healthy development of a brain. Because if you're living in a cold environment, not in a heated house, then a lot of the energy that your body needs has to go into keeping your body warm. Less of that energy can go into actually physically growing the brain, into physically developing the brain. And this is a challenge that, again, energy management is a really, really important part of our biology, including our neurobiology. So physically, the physical environment, the heat, the amount of oxygen. So if the baby is growing in a high altitude environment, it will be different because the amount of oxygen available to the baby's brain will be less, it'll be reduced. Although if the baby is born in a high altitude environment, what will happen is the mother, her physiology already is adapted to high altitude. She's already, and the baby in utero has already grown in different ways. So it probably is not going to have as much of an impact. The baby will, by the time of birth, will be able to handle the low oxygen environment. It'll grow normally. It won't have as much of an effect because its body will be more efficient with extracting oxygen from the air and distributing it. The same for CO2. So these, so the environment does play a role depending on whether the baby was born in that environment or whether it's transitory. The amount of food, the nourishment it gets is very important. As far as emotional, the interactions that the mother and father and the caregivers have with the baby is vital, very, very vital. And we're going to go into this a little bit because, that's the part that's not driven by DNA. Okay, the environment, especially the social environment, is not affected by DNA. And for humans and the higher primates, this is the part that really helps us to excel and become the sophisticated organisms that we are, is our social development and the development through our social system by parenting and education and these formal methods that we have. So it's extremely, extremely important.
Thank you. Next up are going to be questions from Vanessa, Kevin, Rebecca, and Marilyn. Vanessa, what's your question?
Yes, Sanjay, I noticed on that graph around when you become, I guess, an adult, how the lines kind of converge. Is it possible where the brain chemistry is maybe stabilizing, but the circuitry, still changes? Is that maybe why mental illness kind of maybe starts showing its head around then? It's like, may emerging?
Yeah, so that graph does not go into brain chemistry at all. It's only dealing with the physical aspects of brain growth. Neurochemistry is much more complicated, and there are many different neurotransmitters and neuropeptides, not just neurotransmitters. There are many types of molecules that are used by the brain and by the body to regulate the brain's function. And mental illness, a lot of mental illness has to do with these neurochemicals, these neurotransmitters, neuropeptides, whether they're dysregulated, whether their prevalence, whether the cells that form them, cells actually manufacture these neurochemicals. So if you have fewer of a certain type of cells, you'll have fewer of those neurotransmitters, neuropeptides. And so brain chemistry and mental illness is much more complicated. I'm not going to be able to go into that right now, but it is related to it somewhat.
Next up is going to be Kevin, Rebecca, Marilyn, and Barry. Kevin.
Thank you, Sanjay. My quick question about the DNA is, it's usually first, let's see, in outer, maybe couple cells, not DNA. We see that we're born from, let's say, DNA, both parents. So it's pre-DNA side. How do you generate the couple cell? They form DNA, or that period? Would you talk more about that? Thank you.
So I mean, in one of the slides I had, I actually started with embryogenesis, because that's actually the zygote is a point at which we develop the zygote. Roughly is around either 8 or 16. There's no firm definition. It's between 8 and 32 cells that exist in the fertilized egg. The fertilized egg has split up to a point where it's either between 8 and 16 cells in size. And by that time, all of those cells have the same DNA. What you're talking about is actually prior to that. In the initial fertilization process, there are several stages where the DNA of the mother and the father don't combine completely in one step. It takes several steps, but that's long before. And I'm not getting into that part because that's not relevant for our discussion. For our discussion, once the zygote has formed, which is, let's say, 32 cells in size, from that point onward, every single cell in that person will have the same DNA, and that same DNA instruction set will govern, in the same pattern, in the same fashion, their development.
Next up is Rebecca.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the asymmetrical nature of the right and the left hemisphere brain physically, if that is just specific to humans, or we see that in other animals as well. And then in terms of growth rate, do the right and the left side grow at the same rate?
Yeah, good questions. So let me go back to a little bit of the evolution, because that will help us to understand this. So the different parts of the brain grow at different time periods, and the hindbrain and the midbrain, which are the lower parts of the brain. The hindbrain is, you can think of it as a brainstem, and the midbrain you can think of as the thalamus and the limbic system, these structures, which is inside, it's hidden inside. Those also have bilateral symmetry. However, and they have bilateral symmetry in most organisms, but even in humans, they don't seem to show very much. In terms of their function, we don't seem to see a lot of unique behaviors on the left and right hemispheres of those sections of the brain. Okay? When we talk about the hemispheric differences, we're only talking about them in terms of the cortical areas, the cortex, that outermost part in the human brain. Now, that outermost part is not very large in many other mammals. Okay? In some mammals, it's actually not, it doesn't even cover the entire brain. It's just in the beginning, like so even though it again has bilateral symmetry, it has a left and right side. I'm not familiar with the research there, but it's possible. But I would suspect, I mean, again, this is speculation. I would suspect that if there is any symmetry, or if there is any dissymmetry between the left and right hemispheres, dissymmetry meaning if there's any differences between the left and right hemispheres, in lower mammals, it probably will be insignificant to their function, because they would not need, there's no benefit that they would derive from that. Their brain has basically, once they're born, their brain has pretty much formed fully to the extent it needs to. Whereas for humans, our brain actually has not formed fully, and our cortex is really not developed by the time we're born. A lot of the differences in our left and right hemispheres arise after we're born because of our social conditioning.
Wow, excellent. Next up is going to be, let me see, I lost track here. Sorry about that. Next up is going to be Marilyn, followed by Barry. Marilyn.
Okay, Sanjay, you mentioned that something about the neurons. Now, I heard that, or read someplace that the baby has more neurons than, say, the 2 or 3 or 4-year-old, and it has to do again with that interaction. So the more interaction the child has, they retain more of those neurons. They've used them to store information. Is that something, or can you go over that? It's been a while since I heard that, but I know the stimulation is very important, and it involves the cultural patterns, emotions, other things that information is stored, and it's used over, and the ones that aren't used are no longer are there. They disintegrate or whatever.
Yeah. So this is something we're going to go into later in the talk, but yeah, and that's the point at which we ended the talk. I described that baby's brain has roughly 100 billion neurons, and that actually reduces down to around 86 billion neurons by the time it becomes an adult. That's exactly what you're saying, because when we're born, and we're going to get into this a little more. It's actually very complex, and we really don't understand it fully. It's not understood very, very well, but I'm going to go into just some of the rough areas that hopefully will help everyone understand. I don't know if that explains it well enough for now, but we're going to go into it further later.
Okay, we'll take one last question from Barry, and then we'll continue on to the second part of the presentation. Barry.
Yes, Sanjay, very good presentation. I gave a little talk on being a super ager, and from my reading the literature, these are individuals whose brains don't decline like the normal individual, because they find doing an autopsy, they have 5 times more von Economo neurons than the average person does, and a larger anterior cingulate, and they also have more white matter. And I don't know if it's genetics or if it's nurture or nature. And I want to know wondered what your thoughts were on that and the latest on they think there is a gene associated with superaging, but also there's individuals that are superagers seem to extend their cells a little bit beyond. They're always learning new things, and that makes their brain not decline as fast.
Excellent question. Yeah, this goes into a lot of different areas of neuroanatomy and neuroscience. But so the quick answer is that it's both. It is a DNA. It is genetic, and also it's environmental. Mostly, when I say environmental, it's the way the person acts and behaves, and the way they've behaved in their life. As far as there being a specific gene responsible for it, no. I mean, there are very few single genes that govern complex behavior in our bodies. So the chance of us finding a single gene, or even just a few genes that govern the level of neuroplasticity, or the level of neural function that survives in senior age, probably will not be just a few genes that govern it. It's a very complex combination of many thousands of genes. Some of the things that would affect. So, and we're going to go into some of this later, as far as white matter and number of neurons and how they play into neural function and intelligence and cognition, all of that. But just the number of neurons is actually not as important. This is something we already talked about. White matter is important. White matter is very important for us. And there are other things that are also very important. So in terms of the, and also, so that's the physiology, that's the structure of the brain. In terms of what they're doing. They're more than likely behaving in certain ways that is helping them to be more functional. And what we understand is that, and this is something that we know, that the more you use your brain, the more it stays active, and the more regions of the brain, the more structures of the brain remain there. This is one of the most important rules that we've learned in the last 2 decades, is that usage of our brain, usage of various parts of our brain, it allows it to remain active and allows it to remain robust. And disuse of certain areas of our brain causes it to diminish rapidly, especially rapidly in older age. So usage is the most important thing that we've learned, that if you keep using different parts of your brain, and this refers to not only the cognitive parts, but even for example, if you keep exercising, because exercising uses the neuromotor parts of your brain, as long as you keep exercising, then your neuromotor skills will remain intact and strong. Not physically strong, they'll remain rapid. You'll have good reflexes, you'll have good sensation, you'll have good proprioception. All these other aspects of our sensory and motor areas of our brain will remain strong, not just the thinking part. And if you naturally exercise the thinking part of your brain, yes, those will also remain robust.
Excellent. So Sanjay, if you could start off the presentation. I have one comment while you do that. So whenever I hear anything about the brain or about biology in general, I'm just awed by the designs of nature. How simple processes like folding produce this magnificent development. Just simple things like cell division, folding. If you look at DNA itself, it's very simple, right? It's just strands. It's just strands that convert into this enormous complexity, and how things build upon each other to produce the sheer kind of complexity and richness of functions in biological systems. So it's always wonderful to see that. All right, let's go on.